So our first keynote lecture is by Des Higgins, and I thought that unlike others, I'm actually going to put few slides together so you know who he is, because it's a community from diverse fields. So first, this very famous paper from 2014, which talks about the paper of mountains. And if you cannot see the scale, it's quite big. And there's a small part of the paper which comes on the top 100 from all the different fields. If we zoom in, which is a size of bug, actually the 10th paper is by Des Higgins and his colleagues, which was from 1994. It was Clustal W, a user-friendly version of software for multiple sequence alignment. This paper was the third paper from the sequence of Clustal, which was published in 1988 as part of his thesis. So I have a chance to work with a lot of people who were his friends, so I thought I'll just ask them what they have to share about Des. So the first thing was Professor Thomas Dandiker. I asked him an anecdote about Clustal. So he said that in 80s, Des used to play Crystal Quest, chasing crystals and clustals, and looks like this is where the name came from. So Des can also talk about different sort of bugs, software bugs. He loves jazz music, so music bugs. But the bug that I have mentioned here comes from his PhD in insect taxonomy. So this paper was shared by my supervisor, Toby Gibson, who worked with Des for a very long time. And when I asked him, give me a story about Des, he gave me this paper. This paper predates his PhD, where he was going around in bogs in Ireland, characterizing different insects. So there's a trigger warning. If you don't like spiders, close your eye for 1 second. So this is something that he was catching. And he characterized 2 new species. And the way to characterize it, put it under a microscope, flip the insect around, and check for its body organ. So another thing Toby gave me is this picture, because I said, Toby, you guys worked in 70s and 80s. There were a lot of drugs involved. Do you have any picture of Des? He said, there were a lot of those involved, but I don't have it in the picture. I have this one, though. Talking about the last part, community, Des is recognized for his contribution in the community. He's a past winner of the Motu Kimura Prize for Molecular Phylogenetics, and this year he is also a recipient of Benjamin Franklin Award for Open Access. And today, he also is recognized for being the speaker at the first CarpentryCon.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
This we will start with this talk on the Clustal package.
Okay. That's great. Yeah. Thanks, Malvika. Thank you very much for the introduction. I have to be careful here. Oh, that wasn't a good idea. Oh, never mind. Right. I have to stand here. So if I end up drifting left or right, please shout at me or wave. So good morning. Thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. This is kind of strange in that I'm a biologist, and the most interesting things I've tried to do in my life have been research projects where you have a scientific question and you try to collect data or do an experiment if you have collaborators who can do an experiment. But for a lot of my life, I've spent a lot of my life where the experiments or the questions are answered using computers. And when I started doing this, in 1985, and this was in the days before the World Wide Web. So the World Wide Web was invented in about 1992. Remember the first time I saw it, I thought, ooh, that looks good. And it was. I can remember life before the internet, before I had access to the internet. So for some of the scientific questions that I tried to answer in 1985, when I first started doing bioinformatics, I had to write my own software. Which is a bit primitive and a bit crazy. There were packages available, but it was hard to get stuff. Sometimes you'd be at a conference and you hear someone describing some analysis they'd carried out, and you'd go up to them afterwards and say, can I get your software? And they'd say, send me a half-inch tape, which was, if you've seen 1970s TV programs with computers. So you get these big boxes with flashing lights, and you get these big tape, like the disc-like things moving around. So they were tapes with recording tape was 1/2 inch wide. All the standard measurements were all imperial rather than metric. So it was a tape was about 1/2 inch wide. It's the same material used for reel-to-reel recording tapes. That doesn't mean anything to most of you. Never mind. Okay, it's just stuff. And you would have to get a blank one of these, put it in a parcel. Make sure you got the address of the person you're sending to. Write the address on the outside of the parcel in biro, and buy stamps, stick stamps on the parcel, and take it off to your local post office and send it off. And about 3 weeks later, you'd get it back hopefully with the software on the tape. And you then have to walk to your local computer building, hand the tape in, fill out some forms, and then and so on and so forth. So getting software from other places was very hard. And so a lot of people wrote their own. And this is, as a guiding principle, say to people now, given a choice between using other people's software or just writing your own to do it. Writing your own is very educational, but, and you will learn a lot by doing it, but you probably don't have time to do it. It's usually better to use other people's software. And if you do write software, make sure to make it available. You get the more you make it available, the more you get people to use it, the more credit you get. And this is the way it worked out for me, but it took 30 years to work for me. So it should be a bit faster for you. The reason for these dates is that I wrote the first Clustal program in 1988 in Dublin, and I've got 2024. So what's going to happen in 2024? I will retire. And so I doubt if I'll be working on it beyond then. And unless I get some funding soon, that date will actually be quite soon. So anyway, a lot of can you put up your hand if you're not a biologist or if you don't know what sequences are? Okay, almost all of you know what protein sequences are then, yeah? Okay, cool. So if you don't, sorry, there's only a few, but anyway, they're strings of 20-letter alphabet. At the resolution of this laptop, I need to buy a new laptop. So this resolution is awful. I really apologize for that. Oh, okay, yeah, let's live with it. Okay, so you've got these strings with a 20-letter alphabet. In this case, these 3 proteins, protein fragments, these are just little pieces. They're not all the same length. So to line them up with each other, you need to insert neutral characters with these gaps, these hyphens. The stars show where all 3 bits have the same amino acid, and from an evolutionary point of view, you would say that this is a good alignment if at every position all 3 of the letters that line up, all 3 of the amino acid residues derive from the same position in the common ancestral protein. So that's an evolutionary perspective where that's a good alignment. Unfortunately, it's hard to turn that into a scoring function, into an optimization function, a function that you would use to explore the space of multiple alignments and choose the best possible ones. But that is kind of, that's a biological goal that you would like to achieve. Another perspective would be, from a structural point of view, would be if these proteins all had similar structure, and if the structural regions in the different proteins correspond, if they line up together when you line up the letters. So that's kind of structural perspective. You can also have a functional perspective. So there are various ways of looking at this, so it can get a bit confusing. And none of those naturally turn into a good scoring function. And that has sort of plagued us all. If there was a simple recipe, some function, some mathematical function of those letters that you could use that would give you a score, and you simply wanted to optimize that score, then computer scientists are very good at taking problems like that and just optimizing them. You get a supercomputer, or you get a very good algorithm, or you get very good heuristics, or whatever. But that has tended not to be the case. So that has confused things a lot, and sort of ignore that. And the reason we need multiple alignments is because, first of all, as species evolve and diverge, then initially they have more or less the same genes, the same proteins. But as those species diverge, the separate copies of the proteins will gradually accumulate changes, insertions and deletions, which That's why we need those gaps. And the sequences will diverge. But also within each species, you'll also get internal duplications. So you get gene duplications, which when I started studying this, I thought, well, they're the sort of odd man out. They're the unusual case. Actually, by far, the biggest use or reason why we need multiple alignments are because of the gene duplications and the protein duplications. And that's called paralogy. So genes and proteins are said to be homologous if they are clearly evolutionarily related, if they derive from a common ancestral protein. But these orthologous cases, where this is due to duplication within a species, this has happened on a huge scale. There's hardly a protein in the human genome that has not arisen somewhere from a gene duplication. And one of the big examples are the protein kinases. There are about 500 in the human genome. And so, in principle, you could take all of the human proteins, protein kinases, and make a multiple alignment of about 500 proteins. And they have their evolutionary history. That history actually goes back through vertebrates and further back. And equivalently, you could take 500 protein kinases from 1,000 different species, and then you'd have 500,000 protein kinases, and you can still make a multiple alignment because the species have their evolutionary history, and so do the proteins. So to do all of that, you need a multiple alignment. To make the first multiple alignments I ever made were for making phylogenies, and they're also used for making structure predictions. Norman uses them a lot. They're used just for looking at homology, just for looking at how domains are distributed. They're extremely widely used in terms of citation rates. So Malvika showed you this tree or this pile of papers and all the citations we get. The most cited paper since 1990 is one of the Clustal papers. And that's not a reflection of wisdom or importance. So that's not more important than some profound biological discoveries that have been made, but it's a measure of activity. So one of the commonest activities that people have done over the last 20 years is to run programs like Clustal. And so people are making multiple alignments constantly as parts of pipelines or just as parts of analyses. This is one of the first multiple alignments I ever made. It's a set of globins which all have the same, these are all single chains of globin proteins. Some of them work as tetramers and some as monomers, but the basic monomeric units are all clearly homologous. These particular proteins all have the 3D structures known. At a superficial level, they're identical at the 3D level, superficially, at a cartoon level. But they've diverged a huge amount, so this represents over 1 billion years of evolution. And you can see the stars. There are only 7 or 8 stars in the alignment. So there are only 7 or 8 positions in these globins where the same letter has been maintained after 1 billion years of evolution. All of the other letters have all drifted and shifted and changed. So it's quite a tricky multiple alignment to make. And if you tried making this by hand, so when I first started making multiple alignments, we did them by hand. We used word processors. So you don't know what a word processor, for you a word processor is just a package on your computer. For us, word processors were boxes that had screens and where you could make edits and save them in memory. And this was a huge improvement over trying to make multiple alignments on paper with colored pens, which is what people used to do. It's what Toby used to do before we started collaborating on Clustal. And so this is a very hard thing to do by hand because it's subjective, it's frustrating, it's time consuming. You'll end up with choices to make where you don't know, well, should this W go here or there? You don't know. And so it's kind of annoying, and I thought there has to be an easier way of doing this. So I'll tell you about that in a moment. I mentioned earlier about common structures. So in this case, I'm showing the core regions of the alpha helices in these proteins. So these proteins, the alpha helices, they're all alpha proteins. The alpha helices are not all exactly the same lengths, but if you show the core regions, then they look like this. And so this emphasizes the fact that they have the same core structure, the same 3D structure, but this also is a way that we use to benchmark multiple alignments as a way of testing alignment quality. But you can run these sequences with different alignment algorithms and see which ones line up the best, red bits best. So that's a structural perspective on multiple alignment. Unfortunately, that doesn't have to agree with the phylogenetic perspective, so things can get quite messy. This is the first multiple sequence alignment. So I don't know if you've heard of a guy called Leor Pachter. So he's written some very influential, Top Hat. He's written some very influential read mapping packages and stuff like that. So next generation sequencing mapping things. And he's in Berkeley. So anyway, this is from his blog. And that is what people think is the first multiple sequence alignment. It's also globins, because globins were among the first sequences to be sequenced at the amino acid level in the 60s. And this was done by two famous people called Zuckerkandl and Pauling. Linus Pauling got 2 Nobel Prizes, one for peace and one for the hydrogen bond, or for chemical bonds. And there they are getting a prize. They did that work in the 1960s. This was a figure from their original paper. So that format that I just showed you a moment ago, that's kind of Clustal format for multiple alignment. They didn't use this. This is the format that they used for their multiple alignment, where they tried to show all of the possible changes between amino acid residues in a big complicated diagram. How do you do this automatically then? So there's an algorithm called dynamic programming. What dynamic programming means outside of bioinformatics, I'm not 100% certain as to the precise definition. But the bioinformatics version of it is an L-squared algorithm for sequences L long, which gives you a guaranteed best alignment between two sequences if you have a simple scoring scheme. And by order L squared, so if the sequences are L long, and imagine my two arms are two sequences, in order to compare this sequence to this sequence, you have to somewhere along the line compare every residue to every residue. So that's L times L comparisons. Okay, so it's at a minimum, it's going to be L squared memory and operations to do this. And the scoring schemes that you use, so this is a famous Blossom matrix. There are lots of other matrices available. So this is a table of scores between all the amino acids. In this case, they're positive and negative. It doesn't matter what they are. They're log odd scores, as it turns out. It doesn't matter. Big means similar, or big means more likely to see in real alignments than in random alignments. And negative means less likely to see in a real alignment than in a random alignment. And so you can use numbers like this to help score an alignment. And this may not work. I may not be able to explain this very well, so I'm not going to try and do it in detail, but the method works by placing the sequences along the sides of a rectangle. Okay, so in this case we're using DNA. So you have one sequence along the top and one along the side. And the principle is that any cell in here gives the score of the best possible alignment ending at those two residues, starting up in the top left-hand corner. And to get the score of the next alignment in the adjacent cells, it's a function of the new pair of letters matching in that cell and of the score in the adjacent cell. Where to calculate the score at a cell, it's a function of the scores in the preceding cells. Bad explanation, no more time to do this. To explain better, you've then got these baffling numbers all over the screen, which I'm not going to try to explain. But when you do this, when you fill out a cell like this, the best possible alignment score for the full length alignment is in the bottom right-hand corner. And if you then trace back how you got to that cell, the jumps that you made, which are the slightly darker arrows, that gives you an alignment. Now, that's not a great explanation. I haven't tried to explain that in about 20 years. So I need to work on that or get a simpler picture. But to do that, you need L squared steps and L squared memory, right? It's possible to actually compute the score in just L memory, but to get the alignment, to record all of those arrows, you need L times L. And that becomes very significant for me shortly. So that's for two sequences. So how do you align n sequences? And so in principle, that scoring function, where you get an alignment with the best possible placement of gaps, that can be extended to as many sequences as you like. And so in this case, you're maximizing the scores in the columns. And you've got some function to penalize for gaps, to try to have gaps absolutely everywhere. And in principle, you're maximizing or minimal. In that case, this is a distance, so you're minimizing that function on the right-hand side. So it's a sum of all pairs, sum of all possible pairs of sum of all possible pairwise scores in the alignment. And for 2 sequences, that takes L squared time. For n sequences, that takes L to the n. So when I first did this, I was a biologist. I had 4 years of a postdoc between 1985 and 1999, where I taught myself this stuff. I taught myself why this was important, why L to the n, what this meant. Unfortunately, these days, you guys don't have much time. You have to learn this stuff in a hurry sometimes, because sometimes you're doing a postdoc or a PhD, and your supervisor just needs the stuff now. I was lucky. Was back in Ireland. We had a dire recession. To do my PhD, I had to work in a bar. Everything was a bit slower, and I had 4 years where my boss was away a lot, and I just taught myself this stuff. That's not normally a good idea. You can end up just teaching yourself the wrong things. But anyway, this is one of the lessons I had to learn. And so at the time, I was doing all my computing on IBM PCs. I'll tell you about those in a second. These are sort of boxes that would sit on your desk with a television set, not a flat screen. And they cost a couple of $1,000s at the time. And they had almost no memory, were incredibly slow. And it used to take a second to align just 2 sequences. Right? So the sequences are 150 long. It takes 1 second to align 2 of them. So if you do the arithmetic as to how long it will take to align 7 of them, for 3 sequences, it's going to take 2.5 minutes. That's fine. We weren't in a hurry in those days. For 4 sequences, it takes effectively a day. For 5 sequences, it takes a month. That became problematic. It's very hard to keep an IBM PC alive for a month, plugged in the whole time. We used to switch computers off every evening. Seriously, you wouldn't dream of leaving computers plugged in the whole time. It just seemed like a mad idea, you know. So, and for 6 sequences, you're in big doo-doos. You need a time machine, and for 7 sequences, it takes 2,500 years. And so, there are several answers to this. One answer is don't bother, just wait. So if you're to wait until now and do that on my phone, that would now take a few minutes. A problem that size might take. It's hard to know. It might take 10 minutes. Might take an hour on my phone. So you just wait, and that's not a very good answer in some ways, because you have to wait, you know, and you're becoming an old man and you still haven't done your alignment yet. But it also doesn't help you if you have 10 sequences, because you have 10 sequences that still takes 2,500 years. So this is a big lesson in complexity. So you couldn't do full dynamic programming on that number of sequences. So a lot of mathematicians kind of got tired of this project. They couldn't make this project work. And so the what was needed were hacks, were heuristics, were shortcuts. And the first person to come up with a real shortcut is a guy called David Sankoff. An awful lot of the algorithms we use in sequence alignment go back to David Sankoff. This particular algorithm was forgotten about. So he is a mathematician. He's a mathematician who spent time looking at this problem, but tried to do it from a very clean angle. Whereas biologists often look at these things from a very dirty angle. You're just looking for any old shortcut, as long as it works, as long as you keep the boss happy. That's sometimes the only scoring function in town, or as long as you keep referees and papers happy. So anyway, this is David Sankoff, and he invented an algorithm in 1973, which is almost completely neglected. It's for aligning ribosomal RNA. This is before DNA sequencing was invented. And essentially, you take all of the sequences, there are 5, whatever, 10, 8, whatever number of sequences there are. You align them in pairs. So each one of those is a pairwise dynamic programming alignment. Would have taken a few seconds back in his day. You take the closest pair, align them together, and reconstruct the ancestral sequence. So it's an estimate, it's a guess. And you replace that pair of sequences with the reconstructed ancestral sequence. And that reduces the size of the problem by 1. And you just keep doing that. Okay? And that is essentially progressive alignment that people have been using, that was reinvented about a dozen times in the late 80s. But a lot of people have just forgotten about this paper. And the reason I know about it is because I know David. And I met him at a conference, and I told him I was looking at old papers. And he said, have you heard of this paper? And so he sent it to me, because I think he was quite keen for people to realize that he had done this. Effectively 10 years before anyone else. That paper was kind of rediscovered by this woman, Pauline Hoekeweg. For any Dutch people, it's pronounced something like that. It should anyway. It's one of the reasons that her work is neglected is because no one knew how to pronounce her name. And I'm only half joking. But so she invented the word bioinformatics. She's still alive. She was professor of bioinformatics or professor of theoretical ecology or something like that, or mathematical biology in Utrecht. And she, in 1984, came up with a method that essentially was a simpler or a better version of an update on Sankoff's algorithm. And this was rediscovered or ignored and just reinvented by a bunch of people in the 1980s, including me. I had read the Hoekeweg and Hesper paper. I'd read 2 papers by Willie Taylor, and I'd read the Feng and Doolittle paper you see mentioned there, and I didn't understand any of them. I was a biologist at the time, and I reinvented this algorithm in my head one morning as I was in the shower, and only to realize a month later it was just the same as what I'd been reading about, but it sort of distilled in my head. But essentially what you do is you cluster the sequences. A lot of mathematicians looked at this and said, well, how are you going to cluster the sequences? You need a multiple alignment to do that. So you do it based on pairwise alignments. You align all possible pairs of sequences. That ends up taking all the time for the computing with very big numbers of sequences. But you align all the sequences. You pick the most closely, the most similar pair. You align those together and then keep them fixed. Sankoff replaced those by a reconstructed common ancestor. It turns out you don't need to do that. You just keep the 2 sequences, but you keep them fixed together. So any gaps that are introduced to align one of those sequences with the other, those gaps then remain fixed. Okay? So that then is a greedy algorithm. That's a heuristic. So there's no guarantee that will give you the best possible alignment according to the scoring function, but it works to the extent that it tends to give you alignments that that are hard to improve by eye, okay, or as good as what you would have made manually. Now, to a mathematician, that means nothing. So if you try to use that as an excuse for why you're doing it this way, that leaves mathematicians cold, because it doesn't mean anything, okay? But to biologists, it means quite a lot. It means that you can get an alignment that's useful for other purposes. And you can judge the worth of the alignment by the quality of the results you get out of the alignment downstream, as long as you sacrifice a bit of potential accuracy at this stage. So anyway, you do the same with the next 2 closely related sequences. You then align them with each other, and so on and so forth. So I then wanted to make multiple alignments. At this stage in my life, so I was working at Trinity College Dublin. As I explained, this is in Dublin at the time, we were kind of on a couple of computer networks. Kind of. There's a thing called EARN or BitNet. So we could kind of send emails around Europe with difficulty. Couldn't get to the internet very easily. You needed to go through gateways. Didn't know how to do that. We had been doing most of our computing on a thing called an ICL 3900. In those days, every big European country, every big country on the planet had their own computer corporation. And the ICL 3900 was there's this British company. They had been making very good mainframes that were used by banks and insurance companies. But the 3900 was the last one they ever made because it was shit, to be technical. So we had this big fat mainframe that we could barely use, and we ended up doing all our computing on IBM PCs. So this machine here was incredibly slow. This is where you lose orders of magnitude and speeds between gigahertz and kilohertz. But it was a good few orders of magnitude slower than the chips in my phone, by quite a bit. It was a very slow machine. It had almost no memory. So you see, I say 640 KB of memory. So just to remind you what a KB is, okay? So when you think of gigabytes of memory in your phone, so a megabyte is 1,000th of a gigabyte, okay? So a megabyte isn't very much memory. You hardly even see a megabyte in a file size, or hardly even think about it. And so effectively we had half a megabyte of memory to play with. 640 KB, that included the operating system. So we had about half a megabyte of memory to use to do bioinformatics. With almost no disk space. This machine here on the right, so there's no mouse, you'll notice, because it was just a character-based screen. This machine on the right had no hard disk. So to load the operating system, you had to stick in floppy disks, which were about this size, or a cardboard sleeve with a circular piece of magnetic sort of stuff. And the floppy disk held 360K of memory. This is 1988. So for you, okay, this is like, you know, yeah, a long time ago. For a lot of you, if you were born more recently. But anyway, the puzzle I had was how to do multiple alignment on one of these machines. And second problem I have is what language to use. So at the time, I taught myself a dose of different languages. The main one we use is Fortran, Fortran 77. It's a great old language, you know, very old-fashioned. Still used for a lot of scientific computing, a lot of legacy scientific number crunching computing. It had some severe deficiencies. There are two basic ones. One is memory management. So you had to, when you're writing a program, guess how much memory you would ever need for the biggest problem you would ever run. And that's the amount of memory you would look for at compile time. So there's no memory allocation. Memory was allocated when you compiled the program. And you just grabbed, you know, whatever memory you thought you were going to need, and that was it. And if you ever exceeded that amount of memory, the program would crash. And so that was one problem. Another, as it turns out for this issue, there was no recursion. If you don't know what recursion is, neither did I at the time. But it turns out I needed it. Recursion is one of those fancy things that computer scientists love baffling themselves with, or baffling non-computer scientists. And I've only needed a couple of times. There's one place where recursion is really good in bioinformatics. That's for trees. For making and parsing phylogenetic trees, the simplest algorithms are recursive. Okay, as it turns out, don't ask me to explain why. But anyway, we use Fortran because that's the main language we had been using. I had a good Pascal compiler for PCs, but it was a very trimmed down one. I couldn't get I couldn't use it, whatever. And I didn't know C at the time, and this became highly significant shortly. But using Fortran, I made a program on PCs, and to get around memory management, I split the task up into 3 separate executables, which communicated by intermediate files. So it was pretty clunky. But one program computed all the pairwise alignments using a fast k-tuple hashing-like alignment. And so this is something I taught myself, some very fast pairwise sequence alignments. You could align sequences tens of thousands of residues long in a few seconds, even on a PC. This is extreme heuristics. You use UPGMA, just a standard clustering method. It's an n-squared clustering method. But for the biggest problems you were working on in those days, you might have 100 sequences. That would take a couple of seconds on a PC. And we then did the progressive alignment. But for the progressive alignment, here we had a problem. We didn't have enough memory to do full dynamic programming, like I tried to explain earlier. So I used these fast approximate alignments for the pairwise alignments in order to build up the progressive alignment. So these were pretty crude. It gave us a program that could make multiple alignments, but it couldn't handle very difficult alignment problems. But it got us going, and it had something fitting on a PC. And we produced this, and this was the first Clustal paper in 1988, Higgins and Sharp. So it's working for a guy called Paul Sharp. He's now a professor in Edinburgh University. He's an evolutionary biologist. He works on viral evolution. he's still making multiple alignments. Probably not using our program, the bastard, but anyway, that's another story. This was the first Clustal program. So the problem was then, how could you use real dynamic programming to do proper, accurate alignments for the progressive alignment stage? And here was why I didn't even consider doing it at the time. It's because, remember I said it's an L squared algorithm. So if L is 1,000, so you're trying to align 1,000 residues by 1,000 residues, then that means 1,000,000 things. So in that traceback matrix, the matrix of all the scores, if you use just 1 byte to record those scores, that's a very narrow range of scores. You need more than that. But even if you could manage to compress them into 1 byte, that's a megabyte. And normally you'd need 2 bytes at least, and ideally 4 bytes, in order to record the scores in that traceback matrix. And so that means 4 megabytes of memory, just to align 1,000 by 1,000 residues. And so that normally wasn't possible. But then I saw this paper in 1988 by Gene Myers and Webb Miller. So both of these are all co-authors on the first BLAST paper. Gene Myers is famous that when the human genome was assembled, one of the versions of the human genome was assembled using his assembler. He's a bit of a genius. A bit of a genius. Is that not a very Irish way of saying it? I don't know. He's okay. Let me use more international language. He's a very clever man. Okay, and they came up with this algorithm, which is again hard to describe, and it sounds totally unlikely. And I spent a month reading this paper, trying to figure out how they did it. But if this is the traceback matrix that I showed you earlier, with all the arrows and all of the scores, so we don't have enough memory to store the traceback matrix. But it turns out, I said earlier, you can compute the score in linear memory without storing the whole matrix. So you can end up knowing the score of the best alignment. What you want to know is the alignment itself. And you do it by recursively splitting the traceback matrix in half and finding the midpoint of the alignment. So it sounds a bit ridiculous, but if you start up in the top left-hand corner and divide the traceback matrix, the imaginary one, which we're not going to store in memory, in half. That's the horizontal line halfway down. And if you compute the best possible score going from the top right-hand corner to anywhere on the midline, and record all of the scores ending on the midline, so that's one array, that's L long. And do the same starting in the bottom right-hand corner, going up to the midpoint line. You've then got all of the scores of all of the best alignments in the bottom half of the array. And so you've got 2 arrays with the best possible scores coming this way and this way. You then look for the best way of joining scores from the 2 arrays, including allowing for gaps. So it's quite fiddly and technical. But that then, if you do figure out the best join, that's 1 pair of residues in the alignment. That seems like, when I saw this first, I thought, that's ridiculous. You do all of that work, you do full dynamic programming to get 2 of the letters. But it turns out, if you then split the problem in half recursively, do the same on the top and the same on the bottom, split them in half. It then turns out that takes half the time to do the full dynamic programming, and you get 2 more residues in the alignment. And in the limit, it takes about twice as long. Right? So for sacrificing speed, it takes twice as long. You can do all of this in linear memory. If you didn't understand that, sorry. The punchline is we could align sequences of about 1,500 residues on our IBM PCs. And this became Clustal 4. And this was the real beginning of the Clustal programs. So that code to do that is still in Clustal W, in Clustal X. It's not in Clustal Omega. That's another story. I'll tell you about that shortly. When do you want me to finish? That's another hard philosophical question. I'll keep going for this. Will you start waving when I should be coming to the end, yeah? Okay? Or start yawning. Or leaving. Okay, so this is the first real Clustal program. So here on an IBM PC, I had this package. So, big deal. Why did this matter? This was significant for me personally for a couple of reasons. and historically, the way this worked out, normally at the time to do computing, you needed an account on a mainframe computer. What was a mainframe computer? A big box with flashing lights, like something out of Star Trek. And to get at the mainframe computer, originally, when I did it first, you had to walk to it. So you had to physically walk up to the mainframe computer and sit near it and log in at a terminal. Logging in at a terminal was a huge step up over what was before, where you put things in and punched cards. That's another story. I came in just after punch cards. Alternatively, if you were on a computer network, you needed an account on a mainframe computer in some other building or in another country. Most biologists didn't know how to do that. That was very technical. Just to get set up to do that. Then when you had an account on the mainframe in the other building, you had to get a multiple alignment package. And that was very hard to do because there were no servers, there were no file servers, there was no way of distributing this stuff. It was all distributed in half-inch tapes. It was actually very hard to get the multiple alignment software from one place to another. So for most biologists, they couldn't get at most bioinformatics software. But this, they could run on their word processors. Most biologists at this stage had Apple Macintoshes, Mac Pluses, or whatever they were, or IBM compatible computers. So most biologists could run Clustal if they could get it. So one snag was how to distribute it. So the first version, we distributed this by post. Back to sticking things into snail mail. This is a paragraph from from that paper I showed you just a moment ago, where we give the instructions in this paragraph as to how to get the software. And so basically, send us 3 floppy disks in the post. We'll copy the software onto the floppy disk and we'll post them back to you. And I can remember one day getting a wooden box with string around the outside and sealing wax, and big stamps with cosmonauts on them, where a guy sent a floppy disk from Russia, from the Soviet Union, he was Russian, Dmitry Frischmann. He's a friend of mine. He's based in Munich, still doing bioinformatics. And he got the first ever copy of Clustal behind the Iron Curtain at the stage, and where he had to go on a 6-hour train journey to visit a friend of his who had a floppy disk. So he could borrow the floppy disk, post it to me in this wooden box, where the floppy disk inside was wrapped in a copy of Pravda. And I took the floppy disk out, tried to copy the software on. The floppy disk didn't work. So I gave him a different floppy disk and posted the whole thing back. And he got this copy of Clustal and was able to make multiple alignments. So it was very slow. In the space of 2 years, I did this 200 times. It was actually a lot of time, but it's very slow to distribute. There's something called the Embl file server, which appeared around the same time. And that was where you sent an email message to a magic address in Heidelberg, netserve@embl.de. That's Embl in Heidelberg. And you could get software back by email. But anyway, this program worked on PCs. I don't have a photograph of the building I wrote this in, because that building is demolished. So this is the pub next door. This is, it was the genetics department in Trinity College, Dublin. So this is the top of Westland Row, Lincoln Place. This is either mentioned in Ulysses or the building next door to this is mentioned in Ulysses. It's a famous pub. But anyway, that's me when I was younger. I just want to tell you something else though. And I can start finishing soon. One thing that was very important to me at the time was user friendliness. Okay? So these days, if you want people to use your software, if it's not easy to use, how long will people spend clicking it? So some cases, if you're like my kids, about 2 seconds. The attention span is so fast, you click randomly and it goes, oh my God, crazy, go away, get another one. These days, user friendliness, a lot of it is driven by the libraries that you use for communicating with users. So a lot of it is driven by the libraries that are used for communicating on the web. So whatever is used, the stuff that allows you to catch mouse clicks and all of that. Back when I did this, normally the normal thing that would happen would be you download a piece of software, especially if it was written by physicists or chemists, and you'd try and run the program. So you give the name of the program, press return, and the program would crash before you even got started, because it would say, file not found. And you say, what file? And you get and look for the documentation. Sometimes there's no documentation. So how did you know what the name of the file was? You'd read the source code. So the source code was the manual for the program. And a really user-friendly program might have some interaction. So you'd run the program or say, enter wobble factor or something, and at a prompt. And of course, there's no documentation. And you'd type in 1, press return, and go crash. Wobble factor out of bounds. And that was the standard way software was at the time. And I thought there has to be a better way of doing this. So this is Clustal W, the way it is now. But this uses some of the same code, I/O code, that I wrote in the first versions of Clustal. And so this is a simple text menu. So this was before Windows was invented, okay? Before the Windows operating system. So that's how, this window looks like how MS-DOS looked when I wrote these programs first. So you've got a menu, and you've got a prompt. And so you have to do things like, what happens if you press return? So nothing. And what happens if you type in something that's missing? Just say 888, so nothing. And you can get help by typing in the letter H. You know, so there's a simple help text file. So I have to write this thing to flash up the pages one at a time and to allow you to so this is like a little more, but inside the program. And so on. If you go to things like multiple alignments by press 2, you can get help. If you go to pairwise alignment parameters and gap penalty, if you type in, say, a letter there, then nothing happens, or if you press return, it'll give you the default. So this is, I'm going to stop. Word of warning, don't ever do a software demo for longer than 60 seconds. They don't work. I'm done. All I wanted to show you was this bit of user-friendliness. It's very crude. Every piece of behavior there was coded. Every piece of behavior there was 40 lines of Fortran. So every single thing that happened, to try to make it easy for users to use, I tried to figure out. I wanted biologists to use my program, right? I've been influenced by other packages, by Blast. Blast hadn't come out yet, by FastA, by various packages that came out in the 80s, by heroes of mine who wrote packages, some of which made user-friendly packages, and I thought I want to do the same. And other people made baffling packages, really, you know, ones that are really difficult to use. And so it was important to me that people could get the program easily. There were no obstructions in getting it. I wasn't going to charge anything. I wasn't going to make anyone sign anything. And I wanted to make the programs easy to use. And I wanted to make the programs robust. And that is why the programs were widely used. And that is stuff you can't put in a grant. You can't teach that to undergraduates. It's hard to give courses in stuff like that because you can't examine it. But these basic skills are, I know maybe you're trying to do it here, or you can have workshops, or at least hear from people in a place like this. But when you describe stuff like that to software engineers or to mathematicians, that's not interesting stuff. I'm going to finish here. 5 minutes, okay. I'll sort of wind up, okay. So that was up to Clustal 4. Got to Heidelberg. We made Clustal V. V is just a fancy way of saying 5. That was rewritten in C. That was all Clustals since Clustal V are in C. That was done because at one stage we did have a hiccup in the distribution of Clustal. We licensed Clustal to a company called IntelliGenetics. They then thought they owned it, and they didn't. But they tried to stop Clustal being distributed. It was a nasty time. And a guy called Alan Bleasby got really annoyed at this and stole our program. So he got Clustal and translated the whole lot into C on his holidays and released his own version of it. And we knew what he did. I could see the program. Looking through his C, I could see all my Fortran. Even though I tried to disguise it. So I contacted him and said, why don't we collaborate? So we agreed. So this then gave me a version of Clustal in C. So that was with Alan Bleasby and Rainer Fuchs, a colleague from the data library. And this, I also stuck in some phylogenetic code. So this allowed you to go from unaligned sequences to bootstrapped phylogenetic trees in one go. In 1994, we released Clustal W, and that's with Toby and Julie. Julie Thompson, who started as Toby's programmer and is now PI in her own right in Strasbourg, in University of Strasbourg. And that collaboration, it's kind of still going on, but at a distance. This is the last time, well, it's not the last time we published together, but this is the last Clustal paper. Last Clustal W paper or Clustal X paper from 2007. We stopped developing Clustal W and Clustal X. It was written too long ago. It's now old-fashioned. The code is now frozen. It's got a reputation for being an old-fashioned program. We've gotten great mileage out of it, but we have, we sort of moved on in various ways. So it's been frozen since 2007. We never made any of this stuff officially open access because officially open access didn't exist. The GPL licenses didn't exist, but it is GPL now. And it's got lots of citations. Malvika already mentioned this, and that's all. So I just want to finish. I'm going to flick. I've got lots more slides. I'm going to skip all of this. We've got a new program called Clustal Omega, which that's a kind of a statement that it should be the last Clustal we'll ever write. If you know what the significance of omega in Christian symbolism, but also in fatty acid nomenclature. That's omega-3, that means 3 from the end, okay? That covers the gamut, okay? And we made the T-shirts before we even made the program. So Clustal Omega is the current program. It was rewritten from scratch. There is about 1,000 lines of code from the original Clustal, from Clustal 1, that still is in Clustal Omega, now in C, but the rest is all completely new code, and that's all I want to tell you about. Okay, thank you.
For the talk. I was wondering if the complexity is still quadratic or were there any breakthroughs to get it down?
Yeah, so at the time, the biggest problem we had was the multiple alignment stage. When you're building up the alignments, you're doing full dynamic programming. So that always was quadratic and is kind of inescapably quadratic. There's very little way around that. But that's not the limiting factor anymore, it turns out. These days, the limiting factor is the number of sequences. If you have 10 sequences, you've got to compare 10 by 10 sequences. So that's also quadratic with the number of sequences. And if you want to compare 1,000,000 sequences, that becomes limiting. That takes a long time. And so there are shortcuts. We have n log n algorithms for that. But for the quadratic algorithm I showed you, the the L squared algorithm, the full dynamic programming, it's very difficult to get around that, except by heuristics. So yes and no. Or sorry.
Does computer does quantum computing hold any promise for your field?
It might if I understood it. Pardon? Or it might not. So I don't know. If someone can explain it to me over coffee, I'll tell you. Yeah.
Ask another question.
Yeah.
Where do we come in? How can we help mathematicians?
So with this problem, oh yeah. Oh God. By not publishing more papers on this, so as to leave me alone in the field, by going away, and that's how you help me. But how you help the community and for multiple alignment, it's kind of a crowded field. It's difficult to elbow your way into multiple alignment because there are 20 packages, And so some of these packages are old. They've been developed for 20 years. So it's difficult for you to come in from scratch and fix this. And so there are other areas of bioinformatics that are nothing to do with multiple alignment. You might get more mileage out of, but so I don't mean to try and scare you off. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So I wonder if you could comment on what drove the widespread adoption and use of some of these multiple sequence aligners since the year 2000 or since the turn of the millennium?
Yeah.
Since the human genome was,
Yeah.
the first draft of the human genome was published, like Clustal,
Yeah.
Blast, was it the number of citations?
No, so it's just the number of sequences. The number of sequences that are available. That every time you look at a protein, you see much more. So back in the old days, when people sequenced proteins first at the amino acid level, back in the 60s, it could take 5 years to sequence one protein. So you get the letters and you look at them. Because it's taken you 5 years, you're desperate to figure out what it means. And often it doesn't tell you very much. It can be hard. It's hard to look at proteins. But if you have a few examples, it tells you a lot more. By example, some relatives. It can tell you which bits are conserved. You can see patterns of conserved cysteine sometimes. You can see stuff. And since the human genome was sequenced, it's rare to have a protein that doesn't have some relatives. And so almost any time you go to look at a protein, you've got other examples to help you to look at it. And so then you use a multiple alignment for that. And so, and that's especially happened since the human genome was sequenced. Yeah.
So I guess my question is that there are all of these competitors.
Yeah.
I mean, Clustal was first out the gate, and
Yeah.
then there was Blast and Blat.
So Blast is a different niche, I guess. So the direct competitors for Clustal are MAFT and Clustal, or MAFT and Muscle. And at the time, MAFT and Muscle, when they came out first, were faster and more accurate. And that was a row with Toby. So, that's a long story. I could make it short. Clustal, when I made it first, was extremely fast. Really fast, very hard to beat. And Toby at one stage insisted that we slow it down by an order of magnitude to make it more accurate. And so, and I said no, that's catering for 1% of the market. And so Clustal then became a slow program, and MAFT and Muscle came out, and they were visibly faster. They could make much bigger alignments. And they were more accurate as well when they came out first. So it's taken us until Clustal Omega to catch up on accuracy. So Blast is a different niche. Blast is used more widely for kind of a different purpose.
But just to follow up that, do you think your documentation was one of the reasons why people started?
So at the time, I remember writing the documentation for Clustal, and I remember feeling really embarrassed that it wasn't good enough. And we had to submit the paper. I thought, but the documentation isn't finished. And I really thought, you can't submit this thing without lots of documentation. Of course, lots of people submit programs with no documentation at all. And one of the main reasons that people don't give you software, you write to someone and say, can I get the scripts for that? And they say, oh no, and you wonder, why aren't they giving me the scripts? Often it's because they haven't got the documentation together. And so I spent ages writing the documentation, trying to explain everything more than I needed to, and this did help, yeah. Also, writing documentation, that's not something that you learn in a degree course, in an undergraduate course. It's hard to explain how to do that.
I think there are a lot of people in here that are doing a lot of training now.
Okay, yeah.
In a workshop, how to write.
Okay, maybe in a workshop, maybe it can be done. No, right.
It's a shame you don't have more time because I love listening to the anecdotes. Have you considered starting a blog or a YouTube channel where you put this stuff?
Yeah, sorry. So, it's an idea, because this is stuff that was important to me. And it's also stuff that I get a laugh out of. You know, I mean, it's good fun. You know, trying to explain why this stuff happened. And so a year ago, I had an existential or midlife crisis, or post-midlife crisis. And I thought I'd better write me memoirs. So I started writing this down. So I wrote down some of these stories. But it's actually hard to write down parts of it, because parts of it are sort of personal impressions. But I also have to be careful doing a YouTube blog, because I don't want to get sued. So I have to be, some of what I said, I have to be careful how I say it. But yeah, thanks very much. Very kind.
There is one YouTube video of Des playing jazz guitar. I have found it out.
Don't Google me playing jazz guitar. Jazz is just something I do for meditation. I'm actually really, really bad at it. I'm quite serious. So it's just something I do for fun. Like really, please don't Google me playing jazz guitar. No one's heard me. Oh, jeez, yeah. It's hard to find.
I think Des would be outside for the coffee if you want to hear more anecdotes.
Yeah.
And let's give a round of applause.
Great, thank you. Oh, yeah.